Well, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. This time we're going to cover whether hot hatches are once and for all dead and gone. Because if I reflect back to 15 years ago when I sold cars for Mazda, we had the Mazda 3 MPS, and we get people come in and they'd be cross-shopping. And honestly, there was so much competition that even though we had a four-cylinder 2.3 engine, front-wheel drive, 260 horsepower was a lot from the MPS at the time compared to the competition, it faced so much competition that it was still a hard sell. And the fact it was a little bit different in the UK used to get sales for people that were looking for something a bit different. They didn't want sort of a Focus ST like everyone else had, or a Golf GTI like everyone else had. But since then, we seem to have been seeing the slow death of all manufacturers from their hot hatch lineup. However, when I say all of that, I think what's actually happened is there hasn't been a death of hot hatches, but there has been a death of cheaper hot hatches. So if we go back, as I say, if we go back 20 years to the point when the Ep.2 Honda Civic Type R was for sale, you could buy that car in the UK between sort of £16,000 and £17,500 at the time. If you sort of inflate that with prices as they have done, that car should be around £32,000, maybe 35 if you want to put sort of the optional extras and stuff. But of course, we know that the last one that was sold in 2025 was over £50,000. So manufacturers, and this has happened for all cars, as they have to stuff in more safety check and technology and different expensive sensors and everything else, it has risen the price for all cars. But hot hatches, I think, were most sensitive to it because the idea of not buying a sports car, which also have been on their uppers a bit recently. I think basically if you want a sports car, you can buy a Mazda MX-5. That's kind of where your limitations are. The GR86, we'll get on to Toyota actually just in a moment. But I think what we need to remember when we sort of frame this conversation is just because cheaper hot hatches have started to disappear, that doesn't mean that all hot hatches are disappearing. And when you look at what actually happened, I think the market has corrected to the people that are actually buying the hot hatches in the first place. So an example being the Up GTI, available up to around 2020, and then VW mothballed it and said, look, we're not going to sell that car anymore. That should, being that it was cheap, relatively fast, accessible, insurance wasn't crazy out of this world, that should have been the pick for younger people. You know, that if you were under 25, you know, if you think 25 years ago, the Citroen Saxo VTR and VTS, that's what young people wanted to buy. The Up GTI should have been, I know it was a bit of a box on wheels and maybe didn't have all of the chassis dynamics that people would want, but as an enthusiast entering the car world, that thing should have been selling like hotcakes. Volkswagen should have not been able to build enough of them. And actually, in the end, it sort of went out with a bit of a whimper. You know, you can still buy them today used, and you'll find that they're priced pretty strongly because there is a following behind them, but a bit like MX-5 or Golf GTI. Well, probably not like Golf GTI, actually. Probably more like some of the sort of smaller hatchback, maybe i30N Hyundai, something like that. They had a following. It's just that following was quite concentrated and it didn't sort of bleed out into the wider market. Whereas if I use the Golf GTI for an example, I know people who are not interested in cars very much who have Golf GTIs. I know a friend's dad who, you know, he likes cars, he likes going quickly, but he couldn't tell you, every last detail of his car. He's got a Golf GTI. He's got a Mark 7, 7.5, and he loves it. I've said to him, oh, you could change it for an 8, and he's looked at the 8 and he's gone, prefer mine, which I don't blame him. But those people, people who are not that interested in cars still buy Golf GTIs. General hot hatchbacks, though, they need to have that sort of following behind them. And at the cheaper end, it just disappeared. Now, of course, look, I think people can talk about all different economic reasons why that's happened. But I think ultimately, there's just been, especially with social media, a concentration on having a stage 3 300 plus brake horsepower weapon of a vehicle. And I hate to use the term weapon of a vehicle, but it's in the wrong hands, unfortunately, is kind of the truth of what these cars are. Now, does that mean that you can't buy a hot hatch today? No, the Golf GTI is still for sale. The Golf R is still for sale. The Audi S3, it's a lot of Volkswagen Group here. The RS3 with its 5-cylinder is still for sale today. They were going to drop it for 2026. It's been given a reprieve. It will carry on for an extra year. The BMW M135i, the Mercedes A35 AMG, the A45 AMG, Leon. So Cupra are still offering the Leon VZ. You've got the Mini Cooper John Works, and then you can't currently order it, but it is technically for sale, which is an odd sentence. But the Toyota GR Yaris, basically Toyota is saying, we are still selling them in very limited numbers. Right now, we're not open for orders on the GR Yaris, but we will be again in the future. But we simply have too much demand to build the number that, because we're restricted to how many we're going to build for each market. There's a few EV entrants. You've got the Alpina A290, which is sort of the hotted up new Renault 5. You've got the Cupra Born, which I recently tested, the Ioniq 5N from Hyundai. So there has been sort of an address in the market of trying to find hot hatches for the wider audience, but ultimately hot hatchbacks have become 40 to 50,000 pound cars, and that used to be where proper sports cars lived. As I say, if you go back 10 years, and I know we've got inflation to consider here, but I think sometimes inflation gets over-represented in these conversations, and manufacturers having to stuff cars full of very expensive tech as a mandatory factor gets ignored. So I think there's a couple of things that are going on here to rise prices, but ultimately, if the market has sort of moved up to £35,000 plus, it's no surprise that it's Audi, BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen that are, I mean, even the Cupra is part of the Volkswagen group. So of that list I've just given you, there are only two that are outside of the sort of German influence sphere, and Mini are part of BMW. So even though they're a British-built brand, they still have some influence from Germany. So really, it's just the Toyota GR. The sad fact with the Civic Type R going in 2025, I was quite sad that Honda sort of made that announcement, but I also understood it. They said, look, we're going to build, 40 and just sell those as a final edition. Thank you for the market that you've been. We've been over 20 years selling cars in the UK, and we've been a success for periods of that. But clearly, you don't want to buy it anymore. And I think there's two sides of that. One side is, no, we don't want to buy a hot hatchback for 50-odd thousand pounds. That's just, and unfortunately, unlike the sort of creative leasing deals and financing deals that Volkswagen Group can sometimes put out there, and people can get themselves into a GTI or even an R sometimes, or some of the Audis or whatever, because of very, very strong residuals mean that leasing has become viable at lower prices. Honda just can't do that. They can't go to their sort of finance backers, to their lease companies, and say, we know there's a load of enthusiasts just waiting for this car to get to £20,000. Like, well, great, but it's not going to do that in 3 years, so we can't offer you a cheap lease deal. It's become difficult on that side. What I would add in, though, because I don't want this to be a negative podcast of, oh well, all hot hatches are gone, because clearly they're not. I've just given you 10. I could probably reel off another 10 that are still going. They're just expensive, or at least their list price is expensive. As I say, sometimes you can find yourself, there's currently, I mentioned it in last week's podcast, there's some hot deals going on the Golf R at the moment for leasing. So you can still get yourself into them at relatively cheap prices. But I think there is so much now on offer from cars built from 2010 to 2020 that are so well built, so well engineered, and actually, in many ways, every time I get back into a let's just say Golf GTI Mark 7, I realised how well they did that particular car. And when they brought the Mark 8 in, they did a good job, but they were coming off a really high pedestal. And ultimately, because they had to stuff it full of technology, you know, one of the most annoying things on cars 2024 onwards is every time you get in it, turning off ADAS features because you want to go for a drive or because you know how to drive. This is a separate topic entirely, but there is a real frustration if you've ever been in a car and hit black ice, okay, and you suddenly lost the feeling of the steering wheel. It makes you feel a bit sick, okay, because you're a bit like, oh, I've just lost control of the car. There's a real frustration to knowing that you're driving a car that could do that to you at any moment when you're on the road if it thinks that the decisions you're making are not the decisions that it agrees with. And that whole sort of input from ADAS, you know, it really should be a system that you can either just leave on, or if you turn it off once, it stays off. And that used to be how it was. Then law changed, and now it has to be every single time. But that's not the only thing. I just think that's kind of where you see the mindset of cars is shifting. And I say on the other side of it, because you've got more distracted drivers than ever, people seem on a sort of outside of the real sort of hardcore car enthusiast world to be totally uninterested in driving. I don't know if that's people or if that's actually cars have become so uninteresting to be in, and they ask nothing of you. One of the things whenever I get in an EV, so you'll put it in drive, you now have nothing to do with your hands apart from hold the steering wheel because there's no gearing to move. You don't really need to use the brakes a lot because the regenerative systems will sort of do the initial part of braking. So unless you're coming to a stop, you probably won't touch the brake pedal. Some cars have basically no need to touch the brake pedal at all, although I find those a bit odd to be in. But the point to that is you can just sort of be staring out of a windscreen, and because people are so addicted to their phones and to being connected to people, and because cars now have huge screens on them that can connect to your phone, people kind of get bored and they want to do something else. Whereas if you go back, when I was doing photography and editorial for classic cars, you couldn't, there was not the opportunity to give yourself 10 seconds to break your concentration. You know, you're constantly having to keep the power on, so you have to make sure you're in the right gear. You're thinking of that all the time. If you're coming up to a corner, the brakes are going to take a bit longer than in a modern car. So you need to judge that braking because you don't want to lose too much speed as you come into that corner because it's going to take you a while to get it back. At the same time, you don't want to you want to leave the braking to the very end and then sort of hurl it around because some of those classics have suspension like a boat. So there was a challenge to driving a vehicle, and that's been sort of, engineers have done a greater and greater job of making the car more and more capable. But I do have to wonder if that has made people go, well, I'll just buy a SUV and put one hand on the steering wheel and the other on my phone and drive along, and I've got enough safety systems that I don't need to care. Those people probably shouldn't be driving hot hatches anyway. But the idea that cars are now losing their luster among regular buyers, and of course we're seeing a separation in the car world. If you want a car above £250,000, there is a fair old number to choose from, and they'll all be custom built, and they'll all be extremely exciting, and they'll all have proper switches and buttons and milled pieces of metal to make the whole thing feel tactile, and they'll probably have something like a great stonking V8 or V12. Maybe they'll have a small hybrid system. That's what's in that end of the market. Down at the sort of real end of the market for most consumers, you've got EV deals because manufacturers have to sell them. You've got SUVs everywhere. I mean, if we go back to the start of this conversation, are hot hatches dead? Well, Ford, if there's any brand that probably epitomise, probably Volkswagen and Ford, they're probably the two. Vauxhall could be part of that conversation too. But if you're trying to epitomise a hot hatch, Renault actually, I'm just going to keep adding manufacturers, but there's a few manufacturers out there, Peugeot should probably be part of the conversation, the handful, but Ford are one of the big players of building hot hatches. They've got the regular version, then there is, the RS or the ST. Or years before that, you had even the Z-Tech S model was something like a warm hatch that people who were, younger people worried about insurance, so they could get into something like that. And they don't even build cars. I mean, they sort of openly say, we don't want to build cars. We want to build SUVs and the Mustang. That's what we build. Whether that, there's talk constantly that they're going to reverse that decision. But ultimately, that gives you the Puma ST, so an SUV that's hot-ish. I mean, they run the Rally Championship in the Puma ST, so there's a capable chassis underneath that car. But why they couldn't also do a Fiesta ST, and a Fiesta, or even just have kept the sporty Fiesta around from the generation before? I have to say, I think it's that they couldn't justify it from a sales point of view, and I find that sad. Let's say hot hatches are really the everyday person's ability to go and have an exciting car journey that really otherwise is only reserved for people who have lots of money to spend. £75,000 onwards, you've got the Porsche 911, you've got Mercedes AMG GT, Aston Martin once you go over six figures, but you've got the brands that you've heard of. And of course, BMW M cars sort of enter the conversation at around that £60,000 mark. But those are highly capable cars that really, you're not going to get to feel the absolute nths of the chassis on the road. And hot hatches, if you go back to, I remember driving a Fiesta ST, I can't remember how many years ago, 15 years ago, something like that, and just thrashing it all the way home. And being able to, and the car was fine with it, and you're really not sort of finding yourself constantly looking over your shoulder, thinking, "No, I'm going too fast. I'm going to lose my license." You weren't doing that. You were just enjoying yourself. Renault were always the classics of that, and yet today they're just these manufacturers that I mentioned. Ford don't do it. Renault don't do it. Peugeot don't do it. Volkswagen do. There's been and Vauxhall, they don't either. So there's really it's really centered. And I suppose in some ways, I'll end this podcast by saying, in some ways, maybe there has been a return back to the norm. We didn't have hot hatchbacks. If you go back to the 60s and the 50s, hot hatches didn't really exist, even going into the 70s. And then you start to see, the Mark I Golf GTI. And then the wave of hot hatches that have been there all the way up until sort of 2015 to 2020, when they start to go on the decline. And who do you end up with at the very end? Volkswagen. And today, one of the only manufacturers left that you can actually go under £30,000 and buy yourself one of these sort of hot hatch type cars is Volkswagen with the Polo GTI. And so I'm going to end this by saying, if you're out there and you're looking for a hot hatch and you're thinking, oh, crikey, I want to be able to enjoy a car, and I don't want to be sort of lost 10 years from now thinking I've missed my chance, maybe a Polo GTI is for you. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you have, then, I think you can subscribe to podcasts. I'm not 100% sure. I know you can subscribe on the YouTube channel. You may be watching this on YouTube. The camera's up here, so if you are, subscribe to the channel and you'll see us on that. Otherwise, I think you can sort of start a podcast, and do give us a rating if you've enjoyed this, because ratings seem to make a big difference in the podcast world too. So hope you've enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you in the next one.